As the dust starts to settle from the just completed legislative session, we'll take a look at what happened, what didn't, and what is still waiting to be done. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, June 6th, 2025, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome back to Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock and I'm here today with our State House team, Jerry Nowicki, Ben Zielinski, Andrew Adams, and our Public Affairs Reporting Program intern, Jade Aubrey. Welcome, everyone.
Oh, thank you for having us.
So first of all, a note to listeners, if you think you may have missed last week's podcast, you didn't. In the final week of the session, lawmakers were starting early in the morning and going late into the night. They went right over the time when we usually record these things. But now, after taking a little time off to recover and catch our breath, we are back. So let's start with the one big thing lawmakers did do this session. They passed a budget to fund state government operations for the next year. It spends approximately $55.2 billion from the General Revenue Fund, which is pretty close to what Governor J.B. Pritzker had asked for at the start of the session. To make it balanced, they passed some revenue enhancements, so total revenue for next year is projected at about $55.4 billion. Democrats boasted that this was the seventh balanced budget in a row that they've passed since Governor Pritzker took office. In most other states, passing a balanced budget would be the bare minimum expected from a legislature. But we all know that hasn't always happened in Illinois. Let's listen to what Senate President Don Harmon said during a post-session news conference Sunday morning with Governor Pritzker.
I will tell you that I think when we look back on this period of time, Governor, the fact this is the longest sustained responsible budgeting period in my lifetime. We have stayed the course, we have stayed true to that, all while investing in our values, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for working families. So I'm proud to stand with you, Governor. I appreciate your leadership, appreciate the partnership among the House, the Senate, and the Governor's office in passing a good budget in a very difficult year.
Now, the budget package passed without any Republican votes. This was Senate Republican leader John Curran of Downers Grove speaking to our colleague Jack Titchener on the interview program Illinois Lawmakers.
The amount of spending is the base fundamental problem. I mean, we are up $15 billion in spending since Governor Pritzker took office, nearly 40%. At some point, we need to adjust. It's another $1 billion in, revenue, tax increases. We got to start budgeting within existing revenues, and that failed to happen again this year.
So, Jerry, I wanted to start with you. Senator Curran was talking there about revenues. We have talked on this program all session about the state facing a revenue shortfall. What happened, what was in the revenue package, and why was this necessary?
Yeah, so the long story short is base spending has outpaced the growth of base revenues. So the spending that has to happen year over year or that lawmakers want to happen year over year, it's more than the revenue that's available. So this year, there's the number that many of the lawmakers threw around was they had to raise about $1 billion in revenue in various ways. And they did some corporate tax code changes, some really wonky stuff that'll raise somewhere in the hundreds of millions. Tax amnesty for repatriation of funds will bring in some money. But in terms of, consumers or listeners here, one of the main things is they'll increase the tax on nicotine products and add like nicotine pouches to like the same tax that applies to chewing tobacco. And then sports bettors, the sports books will have to pay a 25-cent per wager fee for a certain amount of wagers, and then over, I think, 20 million wagers, it goes up to 50 cents. So, and then there's one of the things that the civics groups are sort of criticizing is that there's some fund sweeps in the budget to where, things like the open space land grant fund will be swept, and just to sort of create some revenue breathing room and to create $100 million fund for the governor to spend in the case of emergency. If the federal government makes further changes to the revenue the state will be receiving.
Okay, and so that is all going to bring in what, roughly $1 billion? What did Republicans have to say about that?
Yeah, the concern is that the state's not really doing anything to balance the structural deficit. With some of these one-time revenue shifts, it means next year we're going to have, probably a similar conversation, a similar several-month lead up to where we're talking about how there's hundreds of $1 million, maybe as much as $1 billion or more to be covered, and what are lawmakers going to do? And then they'll be considering some of the same things we see here. So that's kind of the gist of the concerns about spending versus revenues.
Okay, and so let's turn to Ben Solinsky to talk about where that money is going. The spending package, about $55.2 billion. What were some of the things that go up? I mean, there are some things that automatically go up every year, or at least are supposed to. Where did the increases in spending go?
Yeah, a lot went up, but not by substantial margins. Generally, the budget that Governor Pritzker proposed and that lawmakers pretty much followed was a 1% increase across the board in spending, with a 3% or maybe larger spending increase in some other areas like education, pensions, healthcare. These are more mandated areas. So we know K-12 education, that went up by the usual $300+ million for evidence-based funding for K-12 schools. Higher education went up by 1%, which is actually less than what the governor proposed. He was seeking a 3% increase for colleges and universities. One of the key areas where we really saw a serious increase, though, was in healthcare. This was really lawmakers trying to get ahead of things that they believe are coming down from the federal level that are going to increase healthcare costs. So lawmakers appropriated more to safety net hospitals, federal health clinics in the state of Illinois, more so than I think in previous years. So it was kind of a mixed bag as far as what went up. A lot of things did go up, but really what I think we're looking at this year is how much did things go up, and things didn't go up tremendously high.
Okay, and then to make all of that happen, though, there were some significant things that had to be cut. In particular, there was a healthcare program for non-citizens, working-age non-citizens. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, that is the main cut in this budget. There's a number of other spending freezes or maybe some slight reductions in some areas, but the biggest thing was eliminating the health benefits for immigrant adults program, which serves largely undocumented immigrants living in the state of Illinois, provides health care benefits to them. And this program in particular serves adults between ages 42 and 64. And this program has really just blown through its budget in the last few years, topped out at over $1.5 billion when combined with the senior program. The senior program is being left intact. That cost the state about $110 million in this year's budget, but the state is saving about $330 million by eliminating the program for adults.
So, one of the big things that did not get resolved this session had to do with the Chicago Metropolitan Transit System, which we've talked about before on the podcast, is facing a huge fiscal cliff later this year. Ben, tell us what happened there, or what in particular didn't happen there, and why were they unable to come to an agreement?
Yeah, so the Senate and the House were essentially on two different pages here. Both of them filed transit bills to reform the public transportation system, but only the Senate's version had actual funding in it, which would actually fix the problem. And so just seemed really that lawmakers in both chambers had a hard time getting on the same page about how to address this funding issue. So we know that the Senate was ready to go with a number of tax increases and other things to plug a $771 million shortfall. The amount of money that would have been raised in that proposal is allegedly around $1.5 billion. The House, though, on the other hand, just really didn't get conversations that far. Representative Evadina Delgado told me that they just hadn't talked about the revenue options for public transportation in the House Democrat caucus. So at this point, really, there was just a big disconnect between the two chambers. One was ready to go with revenue, the other one hadn't had time to review it. And a lot of the revenue proposals were just very controversial and made a lot of lawmakers uncomfortable, especially in the suburbs, because they were raising tolls, which are mostly paid by suburban drivers. They're raising the real estate transfer tax, which exists in the city of Chicago, would be increased in the suburbs, increasing the price of housing in the suburbs. There was other fund transfers or taking sales tax away from county governments, which immediately caused the county governments in the suburbs to say, no way are we going to agree to this. And so, it really just kind of came down to, how comfortable lawmakers are with these tax increases. And they were just introduced in the last few days of session. So a lot of folks just didn't have time to review it. And they think they need a more thorough look because this, it's an important issue and the money has to come from somewhere to fund public transportation, can easily be a politically damaging vote to vote for this many tax increases that are going to be very substantial on suburban residents.
Well, and one of the proposals I think that caught a lot of public attention was a proposed tax on delivery services, which could have been, I suppose, everything from getting pizzas delivered to your house to getting Amazon packages delivered. Arguably, those services do put a load on the transportation system overall, but it seemed like there was a lot of pushback on that. I mean, that something that really made people step back and say, "Whoa, maybe this is too much."
Yeah, in a way, it almost seems like when that was introduced on Saturday with just hours remaining in the session, that almost sealed the bill's fate, that this was just not something the General Assembly could take up. Because Senator Ron Villivalam, he agreed with the suburbs to make some deals to lessen the tax burden strictly on the suburbs. But then in place of removing some things that were going to be on the suburbs, like the toll tax or the toll increase, he put in a statewide delivery tax, $1.50 on grocery deliveries to home, which would include prescription deliveries if groceries are included, and Amazon packages, of course, pizza deliveries. And so those would have been paid by everybody in Illinois, regardless of if they live in the Chicago area or even use public transportation in their own areas of the state. So that's where I think things just got so controversial. Lawmakers were like, okay, especially on the House side, just took a step back from this and said, we're going to look at this for a few more months and find some more revenue solutions that aren't going to put such a huge tax burden on the state, especially residents who may not be benefiting from the system.
And so turning to Andrew Adams, you are based up there in the Chicago area. You use the transit system, I presume. How serious of an issue are we looking at? And is there a ticking clock on this? I mean, how much time do they have before things get really bad?
This is an incredibly serious issue for folks, particularly in the city of Chicago, where it's like a quarter of households don't have a car. So people are taking the bus, people are taking the train to get to work, to get groceries, to see their loved ones. It's really, really a big deal if these cuts that transit officials say would come actually end up happening. In terms of what happens next, where we go, the actual funding, the cliff that everyone talks about, comes at the end of this calendar year. But the problem that the transit officials and some advocates will say is that while the funding comes at the end of the year, the budget planning process for next year it starts now. Like, they have to start making decisions. They at some point in the next several months, they're going to start announcing kind of what happens if they don't get funding. They're going to have to start deciding which lines get cut, who gets laid off. Like, those decisions start soon, even if they don't necessarily go into effect till next year. Lawmakers will tell you, though, that as long as they pass funding by the end of the year, which is really a code for maybe potentially over the summer in a special session, but more likely in the fall veto session when everyone comes back in October-ish, as long as they pass something by then, things will work out just fine. Now, What happens in between now and then is a little bit anyone's guess. Things can go lots of different ways in this arena. So we'll kind of just have to wait and see exactly how this shakes out over the next, let's call it 6 or 7 months.
Well, and even over that period of time, none of these funding mechanisms, like the delivery tax, are going to get any more popular with the people of Illinois. How do you see this shaking out between who's going to pay for this, whether it's going to fall on tolls for the people who use the transit system, or is it going to be just regional, or is it going to be statewide? How do you see this shaking out financially?
The state commissioned a study into this at the end of last year, if I'm remembering correctly, or that was released at the end of last year, which basically said that you could raise this much money from a few different sources, but a big bulk of it could come from a tweak to an existing sales tax, just increasing the sales tax in the Chicagoland region, basically the areas served by this, and that would do a lot of the heavy lifting for this kind of revenue raising. But that was not particularly popular during negotiations, particularly as folks from the Pritzker administration and others said that they didn't want to have any broad taxes on anything this year, and that threw wrenches into the situation. So you could raise sales taxes, you could bring back this delivery tax that you brought up. Lots of things could happen, but politically, you're going to need a higher threshold than you needed in May to get anything done, which means that more people are going to be on the hook for the potentially unpopular taxes.
Okay, so we'll wait and see how that shakes out over the next several months. Meanwhile, I want to continue on the theme of things that did not happen this year that we thought maybe would happen. You wrote about lack of action on a major energy infrastructure bill, which there had been a lot of talk about leading up to the session and even during the session. What was the issue there, and what happened with negotiations over that bill?
The issue kind of at the core of this big energy package is basically that there's not enough electricity to go around, in part because of changing policies, in part because of changing, just market forces. There are fewer and fewer coal plants on the grid every year. They're shutting down. And ideally, they would be being replaced by other sources of electricity. Under state policy, that would be like wind and solar generation. But those take a long time to get on the grid. It's a complicated process that involves a lot of regulation. So they're not coming on as fast as, I think many in the state would have hoped going into this big transition period, which means prices are going up. And, this summer, for example, Ameren prices are going up $45 a month. ComEd prices are going up, $10.60 a month. And those are increases that can have real effect. So people wanted to have some kind of long-term solution to keep those prices low, going into the future. But getting everyone on board can take a lot of time and can take a lot of work. There were some serious concerns from labor organizations clashing with environmental organizations, and if you know anything about the Democratic Party in Illinois, you basically got to get groups like that on the same page before you pass a big bill. So, there's a lot of negotiations still to come on that, but people are talking about this potential package coming back and being the scale of, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, the really big reform from a few years ago. So, we'll see if lawmakers in Springfield can get something together. It could come up in veto session, could come up next session. We'll just have to see.
Okay, so another potential issue to look forward to in the veto session or possibly the 2026 session. Meanwhile, there are lots of other non-budget issues that come up during the session, and we were fortunate again this year to have 2 interns from the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. I want to give a shout out to Bridget Fox, one of those interns who was unable to be with us today, but we are glad to have Jade Aubrey, at least for a little while longer. Jade, what were some of the non-budget budget issues that caught your eye toward the end of the session, the last week or two?
Yeah, so lawmakers passed a variety of bills that affected Illinois State Police towards the end of session, namely the Safe Gun Storage Act and then also Anna's Law and Alicia's Law. So the Safe Gun Storage Act is a couple of things. Sorry. It does a couple of things. Firearm owners will now have to secure their firearms in a locked box in any place where they know or reasonably should know that three types of people can access their guns: minors, at-risk people, and people that are prohibited from owning a firearm. Current law says that firearm owners need to lock up guns when they're around children under the age of 14. This law expands that age to children under the age of 18. And it also exempts firearm owners with a concealed carry license, which was a big point for Republican lawmakers this session. One of their issues with the bill was that they think its allowance of Illinois State Police to revoke a person's FOID card is unconstitutional. That came up time and time again in committee hearings and floor hearings on the bill. And ultimately, the bill did pass. It's awaiting approval from the governor to become law, and ISP was neutral on that bill. Anna's Law and Alicia's Law, on the other hand, were ISP initiatives that were also passed, also awaiting the governor. They're both named after victims who are now advocates on their respective issues. Anna's Law requires police officers to take part in trauma-informed training that is intended to minimize the re-traumatization of victims of sexual assaults. And Alicia's Law adds a mission to the Department of the Criminal Investigations under ISP, and that mission will now be to investigate internet crimes against children. So all three of those laws passed and were pretty big issues with Illinois State Police.
All right, very good. Well, listen, we want to thank you and Bridget for all the work you did throughout the session, and best of luck to you in your future. In the meantime, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. We want to thank the State House team for helping pull all of this together, and we also want to thank our audio-video multimedia guru, Andrew Campbell, for helping pull together the sound bites for this episode. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.